That's good.
All right, my clock just turned 2 o'clock, so we are going to go ahead and get started now that it's 2 o'clock. And so if you are able to, I'd like to ask you, of course, to turn your video on so that I can see who I'm talking to and see expressions and that kind of thing. It helps me to conduct a class like this, if you do. If you can't do it because of some other distraction you have, I understand. Well, I guess I understand. And so today's topic is off-market transactions, FSBOs, FSBO. So I once did a training years ago, and I was teaching dialogues to use with FSBOs and first approaches with FSBOs. In fact, I was doing the training for John L. Scott for their HITS class, their 1-week class. And so one day I said, okay, so this is what you can do with in talking to, so we were doing some role playing too. And we were doing, talking about Mr. FSBO, would you, and asking the questions you'd ask to a FSBO. And so everyone was given the assignment to go out and talk to a FSBO that night. And so the next day a guy came and reported and said, yep, I talked to him and we got all the way through, and he says, I'll never list with you. And I said, why? And he says, because you keep calling me Mr. FSBO. And he was offended by being called Mr. FSBO. Anyway, so we've gotten in our industry used to certain things that we say and do, and sometimes we got to unlearn those. So FSBO is sometimes what we call a for sale by owner, and so that's what typically this off-market transaction is going to be, whether they are declaring themselves. That's for a lot of people that can't put on their video. If you can put on your video, I'd really appreciate it. So I'm going to give you a scenario before we start this. And in my scenario here, I'm going to just tell you that, so this is a typical sale off market. Okay, so let's say that you have a buyer who's looking for a home in a specific area, school district area or neighborhood area or whatever. And so there's nothing listed. You can't find anything listed. So you go out and you knock on a few doors, right? And then you ask if there's anybody that might want to sell their house because you have a buyer who's looking in the area, and they say, well, actually, yeah, we were just talking about, putting our house up for sale. And you say, oh, well, great. Well, can I bring this buyer over? And they say, yes, I would love it if you'd bring the buyer over. So the first step when you're working a FSBO is you've got to get an agency relationship established. And so you're going to want to, with your buyer that you're looking for in this example I'm using, you're going to want to have a Form 41A signed, which is a buyer agency agreement. And that protects you for getting a commission for going out knocking on doors. And I would think a buyer would love to have you go out and knock on doors for them and do that stuff, but you need to have something showing where you're going to get compensation from, right? And so the Form 41A, the buyer agency agreement, does that. Now, I had a question a couple of days ago that I thought was really a good one, and the person asking it says, well, can I just use Form 42 to establish that agency relationship? And that was a great question. It got me really thinking. I thought, well, can you use a Form 42? Yeah, Form 42, though, is a disclosure form. It doesn't establish the agency relationship. So Form 42 works great for that disclosure, but again, you want something that's going to establish the agency relationship, which you must have under the license law. So if you start out working with the buyer, as in the scenario I'm giving, you would use a Form 41A, the buyer agency agreement. And if you are working with the and if you are, let's say you just go out knocking on doors, period. You didn't have a buyer or anything, but you're just knocking on doors in a neighborhood. And the seller says, well, yeah, I'm thinking about selling, come on in, but you know what? The thing is that I would probably not want to put it on the market. So if you have a buyer somewhere, that I could put, you could put together here, I'd be willing to participate in that. So then you go and talk to a couple of people who are looking to buy, and a buyer says, yeah, if you got a seller, I would love to do that. Okay, so if you're going to represent that seller, you would use Form 47. So Form 47 establishes the agency relationship with the seller. And if you already had a 41A signed with the buyer, you've established the agency relationship with the buyer. And to be a dual agent, which you would be in this instance where you have a Form 41A signed with the buyer, now you have a Form 47 signed with the seller. You've declared your agency, you've gotten their acquiescence to you representing them in both sides. Now maybe you use that Form 42 as a disclosure, right? To disclose that you're going to be a dual agent representing both the seller and the buyer. And so now you can proceed, right? And so dual agency, a lot of us don't know that as of, I think it was in 2015, that they changed the license law here in Washington just a little bit. And according to Annie Fitzsimmons, they changed it to make it so that to be a dual agent, you must have a signed representation agreement with both a seller and a separate one with the buyer in order to be a dual agent. So you would want to, with these off-market deals, this is one of the biggest issues I see, is you have, if you're going to be a dual agent, you have to have that written representation from both of them, that permission and acquiescence to being represented by a dual agent by both parties. So you'd have the Form 41A signed and you'd have the Form 47 signed by the seller. I wanted to take a minute to just go over this Form 47 with you a little bit and see if you have any questions on it. Because in this Form 47, you'll notice that, it kind of looks like at the top, it kind of looks like a listing agreement maybe, right? You fill in a lot of the stuff like you would on a regular listing agreement almost, except that there's a line 8. If you look at the lines down the right-hand side that are numbered, line 8 has the name of the buyer who this is going to be a sale to. And so you would need to identify the buyer that hopefully the seller's identified, because this also could be a situation where you have a friend of yours who's a seller and says, you know what, I have this friend at work who wants to buy my house. Would you write it up for us? So your answer would be, well, I would actually be practicing law if I just wrote it up and charged a fee. That's the unauthorized practice of law. So I can't do that, but if I'm representing you, I can. So can I represent you and then write the transaction representing you only, and the buyer would be unrepresented? Yeah, that's fine, says your seller. So you get out this Form 47 and you identify the buyer on that line 8. And then you're going to, it's going to have the wording necessary to create that agency relationship with the seller. And so your name is going to go on line 13 in paragraph 2, which is your name. And then, so I'm appointing sellers, authorizing you to represent them. And then in a regular listing agreement, it would be me appointing you to do it. And then on paragraph 3, lines 23 through 25, that's where the compensation goes. So this doesn't say the total commission list side and sell side, does it? That says seller shall pay firm compensation of, And then there's a percentage or a dollar amount, one or the other, that you're going to put in there for compensation. So one of the questions I get oftentimes is how much do I charge on a FSBO? How much do I charge on an off-market deal? Okay, so I've been dealing with a situation all morning, and with a situation where one of our agents has a listing, and the buyer's trying to find a way to squirrel away the selling side commission for themselves, and got a lawyer involved, and the lawyer's trying to write the deal and end up giving back the commission to the buyer, and I'm can be kind of a jerk sometimes, and I wrote an email to the agent and I said, no, this lawyer is not authorized to sell real estate. They're authorized to practice law. They're not a member of our MLS. They have no access to our forms. They have no right to half of the commission, because that's a contract between the seller and ourselves for 6%. And we're not sharing it with anyone other than a member of our MLS who we have given that authorization to cooperate with. All right? So kind of the same thinking with the FSBO. Sometimes that buyer is trying to squirrel away that what they think of as the selling side commission for themselves. So they approach the seller directly, knowing that they were going to list with you, wanting to see if that buyer side commission could go to them for some part of their purchase or whatever. Well, it's up to you. It's up to you. So if you want to do that, you can do that, but I wouldn't recommend it. I would, you're going to end up doing both the listing side and the selling side of that whole deal. It's just going to happen. Even though you don't represent the buyer, you'd represent the seller only, if that's what you choose. You've got to decide on this Form 47 how much to charge. I would say, as a general rule of thumb, if they've identified the buyer and there's someone from a friend or someone from work or something, and that buyer's going to do it, I would say you'd want to charge at least 1%, a minimum of 1%. And that's if, the buyer's not going to need any hand holding or help, or the seller's, going to need very little and that kind of thing. Maybe you would do it for just 1. And it can go up, from there, depending on how much you're going to be involved with the transaction. Identifying a buyer, come on. You're going to give them a huge discount because they identified. Do you know how hard do you know how easy it is to find a buyer in a market like we have today? It's pretty easy. It doesn't cost very much money to find a buyer. They're everywhere, right? So why are you going to discount something for the seller because they identify? Because you're going to do all the usual stuff you would do in a transaction, and if you've been doing real estate very long, how many issues are going to come up, how many problems are going to come up, and how much time it's going to take, and how much of your expertise it's going to take. So you've got to, establish here at the beginning in this Form 17, Form 47. That's how good my eyes are. I looked at the corner of this and I saw 17 and it's 47. So on this Form 47, you're going to want to, on that line for compensation, put in there how much the seller is going to pay you, and that's going to be only that side of the transaction, the listing side of that transaction, right? So what if I had a Form 41A signed with the buyer prior to that, and now I've got a buyer agency and a seller agency agreement signed, and I can be a dual agent. And in the buyer agency agreement, there's a commission established in that, and maybe you put in 3% in there. And maybe in this agreement, you put in 3% in there that the seller is going to pay you. Total of 6. Okay, maybe you discuss with them to just charge a flat 5% rather than 6. That's up to you. But whatever you choose to do, you're gonna want to put the listing side, that what the seller's paying you here, and if that's going to include what the buyers agreed to pay you in the buyer agency agreement of 3%, then maybe you'll want to do away with that 3% on the buyer side and just put 6% here or 5% here on the Form 47, having the seller pay the whole thing. Again, that's up to you what you're going to charge, but I, again, would not charge any less than 1% ever. And if they say, well, you're just writing up the contract, I would say, I wish it was just writing up the contract, but I'm not allowed to just write up a contract because that's the unauthorized practice of law. So through the Colton versus Heritage House case in Washington, I must represent one or the other, and I can't just charge a fee for writing a contract. I have to represent someone. Okay, so if you're representing the seller only, that would be fine. But again, that buyer might be using that you're representing the seller only to try to squirrel away some of that commission that they think is the selling side commission for themselves. Okay, but the agreements for commission really are between you and the seller, aren't they? And they don't have anything to do with the buyer. The buyer's not paying you a commission. And sometimes we forget it. I know the buyer forgets it, but we should never be defensive about our commission. And if a buyer, approaches you and is trying to squeeze some of your commission away from you, you don't have to do that. But again, it's up to you. And if this was a friend of yours who just came to you and said, I've got this person I work with who wants to buy my house from me, can you, represent me and do this, Again, I would do it for no less than 1%. And to be honest with you, if it was me, I would probably do it for 3 or 4%. If it were me. But that's really your decision to make. These are not listed properties, so it's kind of an awkward situation. And you're going to have to talk about the commission with the seller who's going to pay it to you, and talk with them about your value. And your value is not helping them move stuff in and out of the house. Your value is your knowledge of the transaction procedures and your knowledge of what could become a problem, and anticipating those problems before they come, and saving your client thousands and thousands of dollars. In my forms classes I do every Wednesday, I talk about value all the time. We can show to our clients because of our knowledge of the contracts. The other paragraphs in here, I'll let you look through. If you have any questions about them, you should. They're the same as, a lot of them are the same as what's in our listing agreement. But when an off-market transaction closes and is done, this doesn't go to the when it's off market, it does not go to the MLS in any way until after the transaction closes. And after the transaction closes, within a couple of days, you have to turn in a Form 1 ULS. Form 1 ULS looks like an input sheet for a listing. Looks very similar, and that's really what the purpose of this rule with the Northwest MLS is to get off-market transactions data input into our database, so that when agents are doing CMAs, when agents are gathering info and stuff like that. This is all part of that info. Can you get fined by the MLS for not turning in a 1 ULS? Yes, you can. So you want to make sure you get that 1 ULS turned in. And so sometimes there's a situation that I just was observing because I was just CC'd on the emails between the agent and the MLS. The agent had listed the property, had the listing all signed and everything ready to go active. And then the day before, the neighbor came over to the seller and said, hey, can I buy your property from you? And the neighbor said, sure. So the deal was written up, went pending, and it goes, and so then the agent turns it into the MLS, turns in the listing, and turns in the pending at the same time, goes pending, listed, pending. MLS gets a little suspicious about that, thinking that this might be a deal where you were hoarding the listing yourself to get your own buyer in there and write it up and get both sides of the commission instead of turning it into the MLS, right? So there's fines for that. That's rule 2. And so, anyway, so they just on this email exchange, they just simply asked the agent to, if they could go ahead and just put it in as listed, either as an, well, they asked either an off-market deal or it was just listed and then pending immediately after. But it was I just know it was an awkward situation I was reading, and it seemed to work well. It seemed to go well, and MLS was helpful. Here's where the MLS is not helpful. If you're dealing off-market and you are doing pre-marketing of a listing, so the problem really comes in when you know the seller. Seller says, yep, you sell my listing, you sell my property, I'll pay a commission. So you go ahead and do that, and I'm going to change something here. Never mind. Oh yeah, there. That's how I do it. No, it's not how I do it. Yep, that's how I do it. Okay, so your forgot where I was. Where I was. Oh, so you got a seller who will sell off market. You are not allowed to publicize that. So we just the other day we just got a nice $1,500 fine to the agent, who was really fortunate because those are usually $2,500 minimally, up to $4,000 I've seen. Fines for pre-marketing, meaning you've got a seller and before it's listed, you start talking about this listing. You're not allowed to do that. That's rule 2C of the Northwest MLS. And those fines are heavy fines. So you want to be super careful about that pre-marketing of a listing. But if you are representing or working with a buyer and looking for stuff that's going off market, you're probably not going to get in trouble with that rule. And the list, whoever the other side is in the transaction might, because they somehow knew of the seller, but for sure you don't want to put it on your Facebook page, and you don't want to, you're not even supposed to talk to another agent about it, period. Or it's a violation of that rule 2C of the Northwest MLS. So I just want to also warn you in this little segment about that. But let's go to let me just ask you on Form 47 before I put it away. Did you have any questions about Form 47 that you can see that pop out at you?
John?
Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
I hear you.
Okay, great. So when you have a seller that, once could go either way, but they say, if you can find somebody off market, I want to look at that. How would we go about that? There's all these investor Facebook pages and stuff like that. If we had the Form 47 signed prior to, I mean, how can we?
Well, you wouldn't want to sign the Form 47 prior to anything because, and this is a great discussion because now you've got a seller who says, if you bring me a buyer, I'll pay you a commission, but I don't want to put it on the market, so you got to do it. Now you can't go out and advertise that you've got an off-market seller, can you? But you've got a FSBO, so you might say, I know of a FSBO buyers, I know of a FSBO that you might want information on. If you contact me, I'll give you information about this FSBO. You don't mention where it is, you don't mention anything about it. You just say, I know of a FSBO. I don't think you'll get in trouble for that.
Okay. And then once the potential buyer is identified, then do the 47.
Then you
after.
do the 47. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, it makes our job a little hard having that rule in there, but the purpose of the rule, the MLS thing, is so that we don't have agents who are instead of listing the property, they're keeping it to themselves, hoarding it for themselves, getting buyers, looking at it and stuff, trying to eliminate all the rest of the MLS from bringing their buyers to it, which hurts the seller and their and what their exposure would be in getting the best price for the property, right? That's something you've always got to tell the seller. You've always got to be honest with that seller and say, you know what, when you don't go on the market, you're eliminating competition, which means that you're eliminating the push pressures that push prices up. And the best way to get the best price for your property is to get as many buyers as possible competing. Those competitive pressures are going to push the price up. In this market, oh my gosh, through competition. I mean, I used to gawk at all the $10,000 above value that people were paying, and now I'm seeing $150,000 above value that people are paying for property because they're trying to beat out competition. And so, for a seller to not put it into a system like our Northwest MLS that would expose it to that much pressure on price is crazy. They're just doing themselves out of a lot of money. But I get it. Some sellers say, I don't want a lot of people walking through my house. I don't want people knowing about this, those kinds of things. But they've got to understand that without putting it in the Northwest MLS, you can't advertise it. You can't go after buyers yourself. Can't promote it. And when you cut out the Northwest MLS, you're cutting out that competition. So it would just be a really wise thing to try to help that seller understand the benefits to them of putting it on the market, right, on the open market. Okay, I've covered, I know it's just been a half hour, but I've covered a couple of really critical points, and I just want to make sure there's no questions about anything I've been going over.
I do have a question, and the scenario is actually reversed. In this case, I am the representative of the buyer.
Okay.
The buyer themselves found this seller through a friend of a friend, and the seller is wanting to do an off-market, but want to be unrepresented. It's a former agent, and they want to represent themselves. But not only that, they want the buyer to pay both commission for the buyer's agent and closing costs, and the buyer is in agreement with that.
Okay.
So what forms do I need to use, if anything different?
So you would use the form, 41A there representing the buyer only.
Okay,
And then you would, in the disclosure on the purchase and sale contract, you would, where it has agency representation, you would, that's 16, I think, 15 or 16. You would mark seller only, or sorry, buyer only, and seller would be unrepresented.
okay. And that's all I need to do. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and well, not the only thing, because
Yeah.
you want to get paid, right?
Yes.
So to get paid, you would have to use the form 41C. So form 41C looks like, that. And you've just got a couple of boxes to check there that form 41C, where in this case, you would probably check the third box that says buyer brokerage firm's commission, no listing agreement, right? And you just establish what your commission is going to be that the seller is going to pay. And this becomes a part of the offer when you submit the offer for the buyer.
Okay.
Okay, good question. Any other questions?
So then in her case, she would just not have it on the market and do a 1 ULS after closing?
Correct. And she
Okay.
would be, and the seller was unrepresented, so she'd be representing the buyer only. And so she would be the only one who's a member of the Northwest MLS who could submit that to the MLS. So yes,
Okay.
she would submit the 1 ULS. Usually I think that it's the listing broker who submits the final closing information, but in this case, there's no listing agent, so you'd be doing it.
Okay.
Any other questions up to this point?
Yeah, I have a question on the forms for the 41C. So you would check if you're representing the buyer and the buyer's paying all the commission, you would check the second box, right? Additional buyer brokerage firm commission. And then you would fill in whatever percentage the buyer's paying, and then it would be 0 for the seller's offer of compensation, right? If the seller's not paying anything.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So if the buyer's not going to pay anything, you check the third box. The seller's going to pay the whole thing, right?
Okay.
And so this second box is typically used in a listing where the listing commission is only like, let's say it was listed as a 1% selling side commission.
Okay.
And your buyer agency agreement with your buyer says 3%. So then you would fill in this middle section to accommodate for the extra 2%.
Okay. So if there is no listing agreement, but the buyer's paying, like her situation, if there is no listing agreement, it was all off market, they found each other, and there is compensation, you found them, whatever. Would you check both boxes then? Because there is no listing agreement, but the buyer's paying for everything. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, if the buyer's paying everything, including your commission, then Form 41C would not be needed.
Oh, okay.
This is just if you're representing the buyer and asking the seller to pay the commission.
Oh, okay. I heard you wrong. Sorry.
I misspeak sometimes.
No, that's okay. So then it goes, oh, that's the seller represented one. Okay. So then 41A on the buyer's agreement, they're just paying the whole commission, and that's where it covers it. Right?
Right. That's
Okay.
correct. That's correct.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
You bet. Okay, so other questions before I move on? Okay, then I wanted to just mention to you a form that we probably want to use on these off-market transactions, and that form is 22 FSBO. 22 FSBO. The reason we want to use 22 FSBO is because we want everyone to be protected in this, right? But this is a seller who is in a distressed home situation. Maybe they're getting foreclosed on. Maybe the foreclosure is going to take place before the sale can close. The buyer needs to be aware of the risks of all the efforts and monies they could be expending to try to get this thing closed, only to have it foreclosed on before they can do it. So this form is really essential, I think, for this, because we don't know anything about this seller. If it was listed, the listing agent would probably have put that in some comments that this is going into foreclosure. We got to have a sale by X date or whatever. And here we don't have it listed, so we don't know. We don't know the situation. So the best thing we can do is have the seller sign this form with the buyer agreeing that they're or saying that they're not a distressed home situation and they're not going to be in a foreclosure situation that would endanger the buyer's time and money trying to go after it. So really, that's the only other form, that 22 FSBO is the only other form that you would use besides the normal ones that you would use, right? So let's say that I'm representing the buyer and I go find a FSBO and I don't use the 22 FSBO form. Is there a liability for me?
Mm-hmm.
Huge liability for me if it turns out to be a distressed sale situation, or they lose the property to foreclosure before closing. So we always want to use that Form 22 FSBO. And likewise, here's some other dangers to you as the buyer's agent with a FSBO seller. Is what if you tell the buyer, yeah, almost all the buyers are waiving their inspections these days, so you need to just probably waive your inspection if you want this seller, who's the person you work with, to accept your offer. Just waive your inspections. Okay, so you would use the Form 35W for that, right? But what you say to your buyer is so critical. What you should say to your buyer is, I would never recommend buying a property without doing an inspection. Never. But if this is a friend of yours from work and you feel like you need to keep that relationship intact by not doing an inspection, and you insist on that, I'll follow your directions. But I just got to tell you that I would never buy a property or recommend to a buyer to buy a property without doing an inspection. Now, how would you like me to proceed? I just watched Nanny Fitzsimmons' video on that this morning, and she was going, she's the Washington Attorney Hotline lawyer, and she was going off on agents who are kind of pushing their buyers into waiving inspections. She says that's a very cringeworthy thing. You just never do that. You always recommend an inspection to them. Okay, so everything else is going to be normal. They're going to have the inspection 35 or 35W if they say they want to waive it. They're going to have the financing addendum, probably 22A, right? They're going to have the 22E for the seller's disclosure of citizenship or declaration of citizenship. We want to have that probably. We want to have the usual things, the 22T, the title contingency addendum, the things that would protect the buyer. Because if you don't use them and it comes back later and they say, well, what was the buyer paying you for? Why did the buyer even use you? Okay, because a big part of why they use you is because they want to have your expertise, and your expertise should be to tell them, yeah, make sure you do a title, look at the title, make sure that you have oil and mineral rights to it, make sure you're not going to have easements going across your back lawn, make sure you're not going to have deed restrictions, make sure you're going to have a title that you're going to be able to live with. right? Use Form 35, use the inspect to get the inspection. If you're getting financing, get the Form 22A and put that in there that you're getting financing. But same things. You don't want to deceive and not disclose because your buyer's getting a hard money loan. You're not going to disclose that they're getting a loan. You're going to have to disclose it, even if it's not going to be contingent on it. You've got to always disclose the buyer's getting a loan. I can hear Dan Dennis clear down the hall. When I was brand new in this company, I didn't know the names of everybody, and I kept thinking everybody was saying Dan Dennis. And I said, "Who's this Dan Dennis everyone's talking about?" "Oh, that's Dan Dennis." "Oh." Okay, so so questions. I just expected a ton of questions about off market, about. I've gotten a couple good ones, but. Okay, so let me just quickly then go
I have
through
one
that.
question. Sorry, I'm slow. So if we have a buyer and they are wanting to find an off-market transaction and we go door knock, whatever, is there rules to what we're allowed to say or not allowed to say on behalf of the buyer?
Well, it's between you and your buyer.
Okay.
But as long as your buyer.
But I mean, in
agrees.
regards to MLS,
What's that?
in regards to MLS rules or anything?
No.
Okay.
No, so I would just knock on doors and just say, "Hey, I've got a buyer who's looking in this area. I couldn't find anything listed that was available that met their criteria. Have you thought about selling your home? I'd love to bring my buyer over to see it."
Okay.
I actually have another question for you, just as far as the responsibilities goes in the scenario that I have, where I represent the buyer and the seller is FSBO. So the FERPTA and the seller disclosure forms and all that, I have to make sure that those get filled out at that point, right? So I get my client protected.
Right. Correct. Yep, and yeah, and so the FERPTA, if the seller didn't produce that to escrow, then you're going to want to follow the normal procedures, which would be, that within 10 days of opening or being mutual, you would want to notify that seller that, escrow hasn't received FERPTA. Here's the Form 90 FERPTA. And you've got to turn in your declaration to escrow about your citizenship. Or this buyer can terminate. Saying so you've got to, and if you're a FSBO and you're representing the seller too, you got to hold that buyer's feet to the fire, whether you're presented or not, and make sure that that buyer is making their loan application in time, making sure that that you're following up on the day when it's due. So 21 days later is what they had for financing. So 21 days later, you might have to issue that form 22AR, and let them know that in 3 days, the seller can terminate the transaction unless they waive their financing.
John.
Yes.
Hey, how's it going? I wanted to ask you, would a preliminary title search find someone on the deed that one of the owners did not know was on it?
Very likely, yeah.
Yeah, I just spoke with a person who just recently took their property off the market. She said it went all the way to closing, and when it got to closing, they found out that the ex-husband had somehow put himself on the title, and I think she was being represented by an attorney. So I told her, it sounds like you didn't have a preliminary title or a title at all until the very end, and that's when they found out.
Wow. Yeah. So that's going to require a lawyer. That seller gets a lawyer to clear up that title.
Okay, because she was asking me to come over Wednesday, take a look at the property. So I didn't know if I should or should I wait, or
Yeah, you can go take a look at the property for sure, but
do a bill report.
what you don't want to do is give legal advice.
Right.
So all you can do is recommend they get a lawyer right away and get that title issue cleared up and then proceed as such. And if it's still ready to list and there's still a title issue, then you would list it with the comments that this is subject to seller clearing title.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
As long as we're on that title subject. So this morning I had a great question from an agent who has listed a property for a trust, and a person who is in that family but not part of the trust, a family member, said, Grandpa always told me I could have that parcel in the back. Grandpa said that to me like 20 times, and I could have that parcel in the back. So you can't list that property. No,
Like,
she
sorry.
must list the property. She has a duty to the family trust, and we can't respond to verbal things because of the statute of frauds, right? So if it's not in writing and if it's not recorded, it doesn't exist.
Okay.
Okay, so let me just quickly take that scenario of you went out and knocked on doors in the neighborhood that your buyer was looking at. You had a Form 41A signed with the buyer agency agreement. You went out knocking on doors, came across the seller who says, yeah, if you've got a buyer, I'll sell my property to him. Go ahead and bring them on over. Okay. So now you're going to be representing the buyer only, right? You just barely met the seller. So you're going to represent the buyer only, and you are going to, in the seller, maybe talk to the seller if they want their own representation or if they're going to do it themselves. And they only think in terms of commission. They don't realize that commission and representation have really nothing to do with each other. But that's what their thinking is. So they say, no, we're gonna represent ourselves. We're just gonna do ourselves. Okay, all right. You insist. You insist on shooting yourself in the foot. Okay. So then you go ahead and you bring the buyer over. You're gonna have a form when you write the buyer likes it. When you write the deal up for the buyer, now you're gonna represent the buyer only. You're gonna use the Form 41C for the commission if the seller is going to pay you the commission, right? So the buyer identified, let's say 3% commission, but now we're going to have the seller pay that 3% commission. So we're going to put that into the Form 41C to make sure that the commission is going to be paid. We're going to include the Form 22 FSBO because we don't know the seller and what their situation is, and we want to make sure that's not a distressed sale that would fall under distressed property laws, or that is going to get foreclosed on before we can close and cost the buyer a lot of money. So we want to make sure of those. We're going to use everything else normal in our transaction, the 22A, the 22E, 22D, right? The 22D optional clauses, 22T in the Form 35. And we're representing the buyer, so we're going to want to make sure we're protecting our buyer with those forms minimally. And then when the deal closes, then we're going to use the form, we're going to submit the Form 1 ULS to the MLS, to the Northwest MLS. And since I know you're all wondering, I picked for the finals of the NCAA tournament, 64-team tournament, I picked Gonzaga against Arizona, the championship game, and I got Gonzaga winning. just because I know you wanted to know that. I would like to have put the Huskies in there, but they didn't make the tournament. Okay, questions? Thanks for being here. We had a really great showing here today, so that's awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, I
Thank you
appreciate
very
it.
much.
Bet I'll have another special class next week on condominiums. So next Monday at 2 o'clock.
Okay.
See you Monday.
Thank you, John.
Bye.
Appreciate you always. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.